This evening, I've called this, What Would Peggy Do? In the spirit of, I guess, what would Putin do? But it's become more, what would Peggy say? And I've tried to imagine what she would say about the state of things in 2012. Before I properly begin, I must admit that I'm at odds with many of my art music colleagues on a range of issues. I note that many of them have far too much common sense to agree to give this address. Apart from those, squealing for yet more cash for their grand opera, of course, but that's hardly surprising. One need only read their opera plot summaries. I did read an absolutely awe-inspiring Peggy Glanville-Hicks address, which I recommend to you all, by John Rose. And I guess my views are known to the address organisers, so therefore I will proceed, certain in the knowledge that I will offend many and encourage, I hope, a valuable few. In preparing this address, I would like to acknowledge the indispensable help of the eminent poet and psychiatrist, Professor Saxby Pridmore, the composer and my inspiring friend, Dr. Nigel Westlake, the imperturbable and dignified Sally Howland of APRA, the phenomenal CEO of the Australian Music Centre, John Davis, the virtuosic musicologist and mandolinist, Dr. Michael Hooper, and the indefatigable James Nightingale and Philippa Horn of the New Music Network. I would like to especially thank and also apologise to the AMC, the Australian Music Centre Advisory Committee, for putting up with my outrageous outbursts of outrage at their various meetings when I found out the truth about AMC funding. Now, what would Peggy say about the state of classical music in Australia? Here I'm referring to notated music primarily, but the definition, I'm sure, can embrace all art music. I think she would notice immediately how well women are doing as performers and composers. A quick glance through a wonderful recent publication, Women of Note, by Rosalind Appleby, confirms this, and I strongly recommend that publication to you all. Peggy would then wryly observe how women are now just as equally ignored and discriminated against by our taxpayer-subsidised orchestras and opera companies as their male counterparts. Warning! Warning! Statistic alert. Only 7%. 7%. Shows 7 fingers for photo opportunity, not a sausage. 7% of our orchestral programs, and even less of our opera season, is Australian music. And this includes old music by wannabe Poms, such as Percy Grainger, and wannabe Elgars, wannabe Ravels, wannabe Brahms, Poots and Parrys, etc., etc. Peggy would rejoice that there is still an Australian music centre representing Australian composers and performers to the world. This in spite of the efforts of certain hostile funding bodies to starve it of funds. Why, she would ask, is this amazing resource, under the dogged and inspired leadership of John Davis, not directly federally funded, like the National Film and Sound Archive or indeed the National Library, such that its important work is not constantly impeded by endless funding applications and mystifying movements of the goalposts? Why is the AMC at a crisis point and facing eviction by the New South Wales government? Peggy would wonder, as do I. She would marvel at how well groups like Astra have done, a group I mention simply because I can speak from long experience with them. I know there are many others struggling to survive. The Astra Chamber Music Society, for those of you unfamiliar with our musical equivalent of La Mama Theatre, is based here in Melbourne. Astra has managed for over 60 years, if it was a competition between them and the ballet, I think they'd win, to present new Australian compositions and nurture new performers, despite capricious and insufficient funding, which recently has been cut to zero, I'm ashamed to say. Boo Thank you. In my reckoning, Astra's work under the extraordinary John McCaughey has premiered more Australian compositions than any other group. And many performers, myself included, continue to be developed by this wonderful, cash-strapped organisation. I would like to know who it was at the Australia Council who knocked back their meagre funding this year, and for what reason. This is especially galling in the light of the gluttonous triennial funding of the orchestras and opera, which together produce the pathetic aforementioned statistic of Australian work. Peggy Glanville-Hicks would be astonished at the diversity of recordings of Australian fine music, or art music rather, by self-funded independent labels like Tall Poppies and Move, despite the unfair advantage of extravagantly taxpayer-funded labels, which produce mainly old-fashioned pap in comparison. Do we really need obscure French operas, another boxed set of dreary and expensive Mahler symphonies? Is this the apex of Australian culture? Or Wagner spin cycles? Give me a break. Peggy would be outraged that no, I repeat, no, Australian conductor laureates are leading our orchestras or championing our composers, as Challender and Patrick Thomas briefly did with the SSO, giving left field composers like Carl Vine an opportunity to develop their skills with orchestral music. In the case of Carl, I must also mention the support he received from the wonderful Graham Murphy and the Sydney Dance Company, and Astra, particularly John McCaughey, without whose house and bathroom accessories Carl's string quartet, known as the Brunswick, would not have been written. Peggy would be further outraged that the very same operas by Bellini, Mozart, Verdi and Wagner, which she heard as a girl, are still being presented now at Australian taxpayers' expense, while her own operas and symphonic works are ignored, as are most other Australian composers. When a tourist visits the Sydney Opera House, they should not be left wondering why there is not an Australian opera going on somewhere inside it, and why Australians have such an anachronism of a building. Even Dame Joan does not seem to have been interested in Australian opera composers, though she was still singing into the late 1980s. Her husband, Richard Bonning, seems even less so. Curious that such people still wield power over repertoire choices, excluding Australian work at Opera Australia, yet happily demand taxpayer support. As an aside, these ancient Bellinis, Mozart, Verdis and Wagners must inevitably be pale imitations of superior overseas productions. We could never hope to match overseas cultural budgets, and neither should we try. Personally, I think the money is better spent on original work. Instead of spending 10 million, or whatever it is, on an individual sporting gold medal, why not create a decent Australian opera or symphony with this amount? It would provide jobs for untold numbers of Australian musicians into the distant future, and maybe even give audiences some pleasure and self-respect. It would certainly justify the existence of these gas-guzzling music organisations to the taxpayer more than their current programming. Peggy would be deeply distressed at the foxification, pronounced farxification, of our culture. I refer here to the monopolisation of entertainment. I believe this would make Peggy even more determined to produce independent work, more determined to resist the awful competition philosophy triumphantly promoted by certain powerful local individuals. Peggy would note that in the area of classical music, the Australian cultural cringe definitely remains. There is no problem with the number or quality of Australian composers or performers. We punch well above our weight for such a population. There is a problem, however, and it is that Australian classical music audiences, for some reason, still regard Australian music and performers as inferior. I'm sure she would think the persistence of this false belief to indicate abject failure on the part of our arts administration and management cartels. Peggy would wonder why there is not a magnificent Stewart and Sons piano in every concert hall and school in Australia, and bemoan the fact that once again Australian ingenuity and superior design, such as that of these New South Wales instrument makers, are struggling to survive against the cultural cringe and against monopolistic and reactionary foreign brands. And no, I am not a Stewart & Sons artist, although I wish I was, Wayne, if you're listening. Despite the lack of funding encouragement, Peggy would be delighted at the emergence of young Australian advocates of new music, such as Zubin Kanga, Ensemble Offspring, Claire Edwards, Anthony Pateras, Aura Go, James Nightingale, all the folk at the New Music Network, Eugene Ugeti and Speak Percussion, Genevieve Lacey, Ian Grandage, Jolt Arts and James Hullock, Vanessa Tomlinson, Eki Waldheim, the Australian Art Orchestra, Kate Neal, Ashley Smith, Natsuko Yoshimoto, Elliot Geiger, my siblings, Dom, Byrne and Rowan, Peter DeYaga, the astonishing brothers Dean and Gregorian, Annie Say, Matthew Heinsohn, Jane Stanley and Damien Barbella, to name but a few who've passed through my narrow orbit of late. Peggy would be frustrated by the failure of classical music around the globe to adapt to this new world full of technology. Everything is miniaturizing and being made more efficient, smarter, doing more with less. And I believe it is in this light that she would carefully examine the current, persisting arrangement of opera companies, orchestras and the conservatoria. I do not think she would be desperate to preserve the golden age of classical music. At least I don't believe she would want to preserve the golden age of classical music at any cost. There is a very good reason why the grand opera companies and orchestras worldwide are closing down. That is because their time is past, and no amount of taxpayer funding to prop them up will hide the fact of their cultural superfluousness, which they have brought upon themselves. If the wealthy wish to have such entertainments free of, quote, incomprehensible new works, then they can surely pay for them in toto without ransacking the taxpayer. Peggy would be quizzical about the smugness of those musicians who have, quote, made it. Made it here refers to being parked in a salaried position with a classical music organisation. This accepted and celebrated pinnacle of success is a numbingly low level of aspiration for young musicians. It requires no creativity, no imagination, no originality or innovation on behalf of the musician, yet is still handsomely and artificially remunerated. In general, there are very hard-working exceptions, of course. In general, these are the very sort of musicians most antagonistic to new music, possibly because it requires extra practice. She would be surprised at the dumbed-down conservatism of the dribble of Australian and international contemporary music that is actually heard, particularly that provided by public subsidised public radio, which is peculiarly sensitive to the opinion of old fogies like the Hecklers, a remarkably successful conservative pressure group in the 1990s. She would recoil at the failure of our major art music organisations to educate full stop. In particular, she would be rankled by the failure of our major art music organisations to educate the wider community. It is this failure to educate and challenge the public which leaves new music struggling to be heard in this country. She would not tolerate the excuse by the accountants that we cannot perform new music because people are unfamiliar with it and don't come, and horror of horrors, we lose money. Yes, we might lose a few subscribers in the early stages of the education reform, but they will be replaced by younger people who will subscribe for longer anyway. She would also ask, why is classical music so conservative in Australia? Where, she would want to know, is the Venice Biennale of Australian classical music? I note, even in class-obsessed London, the thriving figures for new music concerts and theatre at the expense of classical mainstream concerts and now even musicals, at least according to a Guardian article earlier this year. Peggy would see that the real action is no longer in grand opera, symphony orchestras, or any of the standard dinosaur models which ape old Europe, but in our brave independent artists and theatre and bands and she would be heavily involved with them, encouraging their content. Peggy Glanville-Hicks would no doubt observe that in the arena of art music, we are still very much a nation of followers. We are still led by the tastes of the overseas market, particularly as dictated by the likes of Gramophone magazine and its piss-poor, inbred Australian cousins, who shamelessly promote the likes of Andre Rieu. I think Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton had it exactly right in their send-up of classical music in the film Limelight. Gramophone critics and their toadies are still operating as arbiters of taste, even after being utterly exposed as pompous fakes by the Joyce Hatto affair. Maybe the mag should be renamed Gramophony. Let me remind you of this Milli Vanilli of the classical world. Joyce Hatto was a British pianist whose husband, Barry, kept up the pretense of her recording career by passing off other pianists' work as her own. He could do this as he owned a recording studio. Many prominent critics were fooled, most notably those working for Gramophone magazine. They praised Joyce's recordings with comments like the greatest pianist no one's ever heard. The embarrassing fact was that Gramophony described the same recording before it was stolen and when played by the true pianist as, not being quite up to scratch. Forgive the pun. It took the then new iTunes database, Grace Note, to unmask the fraud. No human music critic was clever enough, apparently. By the time the hoax was exposed, Joyce's recordings had covered most of the main virtuoso repertoire available on CD, an impossible feat which should have raised early questions, instead of which received fawning admiration. I'm sure Peggy would have cottoned on immediately, if for no other reason than the hilariously fictitious orchestras that Ms. Hatto performed with. René Koller conducts the National Philharmonic Symphony Orchestra, indeed. Thus, Gramophony is not infallible, in fact, far from it. Decisions by its critics regarding the quality and value of a piece of work are determined clearly, not by any objective standard, but by 1, the artist's name and influence and ethnicity, 2, record label status, and 3, advertising revenue for the journal, which must exert influence. This hoax blew away the lie of meritocracy in classical music, which is sold to the young in the form of competitions, Eisteddfods, and even exams. It also exposed the lie of definitive interpretations and any claims of authenticity in classical music recording, in spite of the precious justifications of some early music apologists. One should simply not believe what one hears on recordings. Glenn Gould was far ahead of his time in this regard, as in so many other things. This is a major plank of this address. The consequence of surrendering to a single authority, like Gramophony, is homogeneous interpretations and performances. That is, success depends upon conformity. This is especially worrying for the influence such magazines still have on Australian classical music audiences and therefore our composers and young musicians. For example, look at recent programs presented by our youth music organisations. I can't think of anything less inspiring as a young Australian than to play Mendelssohn with an English conductor in a small recital hall in Melbourne. But hang on, yes I can. About a year ago, the Australian Youth Orchestra toured Germany. And what did they display of their home country? German repertoire with a German conductor. Next season, at the professional level, we have wall-to-wall Verdi, courtesy of Opera Australia. As an Australian taxpayer, drowning in debt, courtesy of the ATO's pay-as-you-go catastrophe, it is doubly frustrating to know that my tax is funding all this dead white European male music for the diverting entertainment of the well-heeled, with inflated ticket prices excluding the poor, and so little of it is funding new Australian composition. Classical music generally is becoming so conformist that disclavier music, that is, pianos linked to computers, is indistinguishable from human-made music. Thanks to the recording industry, this conformity is present in opera, symphonic music, and now especially the more popular forms of music. It gets worse. So monochrome is the repertoire and interpretation required of orchestras these days that, if you have the money, Sony is now able to provide you with a robot conductor. Talking of robots, the Sydney International Piano Competition of Australia, SIPCA. SIPCA is an acronym which would sound to Peggy, I'm sure, like a particularly nasty venereal disease involving death by hiccups. I'm sure she would refer to this as the Sydney Idiotic Piano Convulsion Association for its target audience and token support of decorative and safe Australian composition, mercifully kept well clear of contaminating the orchestral finals, however. SIPCA, Peggy would observe, appears to be having the same effect on Australian youth as the designation of some kids as potentially elite athletes. That is, turning all the other kids off A, classical music, and B, exercise for life. Kids detect the futility of striving in such unfair and corrupt arenas. If you doubt this, check out the figures for childhood obesity and the numbers for pianists admitted to our music academies, to say nothing of their level of competency. Here's an idea: why don't we just register Rachmaninoff piano concertos as a Winter Olympic sport and forget any notions of the music as an art form? You could have the judges holding up scorecards and a world record timeline, tickling the first violins to keep them awake. Might have the added bonus of killing off those piano concertos in one season. The Hungarian film Mephisto deals with the Faustian bargain an actor makes by staying in Hitler's Germany for work as Adolf's favourite actor, whilst his more conscience-stricken colleagues give up their careers and flee as penniless refugees. I think this film is a great allegory for the way the fanatical religion of capitalism has turned art music, which I think should be accessible for everyone, into a competition only for the elite and connected, totally corrupting them in the process. On the topic of competitions, although I've been successful, I'm opposed to these events, just in case you were wondering. I will now quote from my own chapter in Martin Compt's recent book, Australian Pianists. The competition industry is ubiquitous and is as fatally connected and indomitable as are the fossil fuel industries. I feel I've earned the right to criticise the received wisdom by achieving significant success in competitions, but this does not mean I condone them. I continue. I needed an environment outside Australia where who I learnt from didn't matter and where I could neutrally judge my abilities. I go on. This appalling state of affairs, that one could only perform if one paid an entry fee, I soon discovered pretty much summed up the entire classical music scene. Just take a peek at the gigantic publication Musical America, where desperate performers pay unbelievable sums for ad space to be totally ignored by booking agents. I quickly realised that in competitions there were no criteria apart from the obvious requirements for note-perfect readings and an ability to stay within an inoffensive interpretation. Also in that chapter, I think it is impossible to be engaged with society as an artist, if that's what one thinks one is, without a broader view of your art form. My broader view, then, is that when competition is the dominant philosophy of society, cheating, Lance Armstrong, selfishness, greed, apathy, exploitation, stupidity, and murderous conflict are inevitable. But what does science have to tell us about competition? Darwin's Origin of Species and Richard Dawkins' Selfish Gene lead logically to the conclusion that if the human species is to survive at all, it must be intelligent enough to recognise that competitive and aggressive genes cause destruction in a civilised society, to say nothing of the insane vandalism inflicted on the irretrievable biosphere. Those who think a society uncivilised, without its grand opera and expensive orchestras, should carefully reconsider their embrace of a philosophy red in tooth and claw, such as competition philosophy and its insane handmaiden, growth economics. As musicians, we should be smart enough to realise that perpetuating competition philosophy does not allow for diversity. As evidence, Your Honour, Exhibit A, the piano. Exhibit B, the car. Exhibit C, Fox News, or indeed classical music. Instead, it makes us fellow travellers in this destruction, just as the protagonist in the film Mephisto. I'm sure Peggy would be desperately sticking up for the planet and encouraging all her colleagues to do the same rather than meekly accepting the fate engineered for us by the druids of competition philosophy. Here, this unconscious acceptance of competition philosophy reminds me very much of Frank Zappa's paraphrase of science fiction writer Harlan Ellison. Quote, "The most plentiful element in the universe is not hydrogen but stupidity." What does history have to tell us about competition in music? Franz Liszt was the instigator and populariser of the piano recital as the experimental music arena in the 1840s. He drove the evolution of pianos because he kept busting the fragile little things. Apart from his astounding generosity, I like most of all his relishing of risk and lack of preciousness. On one occasion in 1856, he found himself presented with a gravity-fed action monstrosity by the King of Bohemia. He calmly gave a 2.5-hour recital on it without turning a hair, but turning plenty of hairs on the ladies present. Liszt completely rejected the fashion of the time of referring to first-class and second-class pianists. He thought it both too difficult and pointless to grade keyboard performers. Franz, along with Peggy, I believe, would be spinning in their graves every time there are playoffs between not just keyboard instruments, but even vastly differing instrument species in the ABC Young Performers competition. I delight in Liszt's words, his desire to, quote, "hurl my lance into the boundless realms of the future." Here, his lance was a metaphor for music, and he believed music should soar unimpeded into the future. While we are dealing with this visionary, I should mention his other famous quote, that musicians should stop being oarsmen and instead seize the rudder. Not for him any simpering capitulation to the opinions of accountants, merchants, kings or clergy, and certainly not to statistical calibrations of audience demographics, strategic outcomes, subscriber accessibility, or any of the inane management ease spouted by our music industry guardians. Further support for my position comes from another legendary musical figure, Bela Bartok. When asked about competitions, he famously dismissed them as, quote, "for horses." We should remember that this genius was also a man of deep moral convictions. With the rise of Nazism, he escaped from his beloved Hungary and his lucrative career for a glorious life of spectacular neglect in New York. Due to competitions, currently the piano recital, apparently, has nothing new to offer music and is therefore moribund. For example, the complete lack of any modernist music in the 2010 Carnegie Hall Piano series. I haven't bothered to check recently, it's far too depressing. As an aside, so great is the need of competition performers to impress. One French pianist I came across, a veteran of over 70 international competitions, was capable of playing so loudly that, in the words of one reviewer, he could induce nosebleed. But he was so monomaniacally limited in repertoire that he had not even heard of Olivier Messiaen, perhaps the greatest French 20th century composer. At the 1993 Pogorelich competition, he asked me, an Australian, for advice on where to start with Messiaen, simply because it looked like a good competition strategy. This is the default competition winner type, a belting ignoramus. Within the competition circuit, and increasingly in the profession, players with such a limited mindset and narrow band of music proliferate, altering the art form very much for the worse. So great is the need of these competition chairmen and juries to regard themselves as important to the careers of participants that in the case of Sipka, it was claimed a past prize winner was making a lucrative South American career, though he had been dead 10 years. It's true. This same unscrupulous competition accepted its start-up funding from a tobacco company, from a huge tobacco company, yet its spokesman at the time, this is 1977, 40 years after scientists had proved smoking caused cancer, its spokesman said its primary aim was to, clasp hands under chin, cherub face, look after young pianists. Yeah, right. Many European piano competition judges hold summer courses specifically advertised as very expensive, intensive training sessions on how to win piano competitions. Must be the musical equivalent of painting by numbers. A particularly superficial, glossy Australian classical mag persists in running competitions between dead musicians in what can only be described as a final, macabre insult to their corpses and achievements. The clearly ignorant and insensitive readers of this unintended Hello magazine for the dead appear to relish these contests. That is, if one believes the website postings are from actual readers and not simply the editors themselves. One boastful pianist claimed for decades that he had won a leading international Chopin competition, although there is no evidence he even entered one. Since the internet, this has gradually been dropped from his biography. After my unexpected success in the 93 Pogorelic competition, he accosted me backstage in Sydney and thought it necessary to tell all within earshot that he too was the first prize winner in several international competitions. I was rendered speechless at the tremendous insecurity lack of international competition success had wrought on this sad individual, as if such success was more important to him than music itself. Similarly, a notorious cherry picker of promising young Australian talent was spreading the barefaced lie around New York that he was the teacher of the winner of this Pogorelic competition, i.e. yours truly, this to cement his employment and reputation as a teacher of competition winners at a New York music school itself, in competition with other New York music schools. The level of desperation is farcical and reminds me of an Escher lithograph of futile staircases. Do competitions do any good? Well, judging by the conservative state of classical music and the rapidly diminishing audiences, one would have to say, resoundingly, no. Unfortunately, the whole industry, the new speak of capitalism reduces everything to this crude input-output paradigm. The whole industry is built on this philosophy. Audiences / music consumers / customers cannot seem to make up their minds about the quality of a performer without a list of competition wins and ditto for every level of middlemen. The only winners in all of this, of course, are the competitions themselves and their junketing juries. Check out the self-congratulatory SIPCA website, for instance. Music itself, I believe, is lost in the histrionics of egotistical fops. Some of these fops now even travel the world spreading the good news about competitions like brain-dead priests in some flaky cult. You won't, of course, find these priests helping out the Occupy movement. In hindsight, it is axiomatic that the cause of innovative 20th century music was served much better by contemporary dance companies. The Rite of Spring, Billy the Kid, and even Vine's first piano sonata spring immediately to mind. But what about exams? Surely kids need goals. Well, do they in an art form? What are they studying music for? Do exams foster more understanding of music than the guidance of an enlightened teacher? With kids now expected to live until the age of 120, what is the point of having to race through grades and competitions? Tiger mums and dads? What is the end point of this dubious and frankly creepy fascination with younger and younger performers? Fetuses with placental glands? Surely we should be equipping kids instead with a genuine love of and a curiosity about music that will sustain them for this increased lifespan. How is this achieved? Through the competition and examination mentality and its stultifying conformity and conservatism, its mindless celebration of immaturity, superiority complexes, and insensitivity. Our education systems are designed to produce ideal students, but surely what we need are thinking musicians. How many people have you come across who lament the fact that they gave up music in their teens because they were not passing exams or winning prizes or pieces of paper? Their teachers were simply too unimaginative or harassed by finances to suggest alternatives to these cookie-cutter exams to keep their students' interest alive. Luckily for us, fantastic musicians like Paul Grabowski, Judy Bailey, Tony Gould, and Mike Nock struck enlightened teachers who encouraged their uniqueness. I wonder what society would look like if we adopted the same attitude to reading and writing. Does it matter how long it takes individuals to learn to speak or to read? Pity Einstein would not have made the grade. What are the alternatives for performance training? Well, I would like to see the emphasis in teaching shift from the performer to the three elements necessary for satisfying music making: the composer-improviser, audience, and player-improviser. I would also like to see the intelligent, inspired exploration of the question of interpretation. In Indian classical music, for instance, it is the opening up of interpretation of the various yatis and ragas, and the innovations in improvisation, which are prized by Indian audiences. If Western art music is to remain part of contemporary culture and not be simply relegated to the museum, then it must continuously reinvent and catalyse itself. Competitions and exams block this process by reinforcing the status quo. And we know where that ends: advertisements for supermarkets. Even chamber music is now infected with competitions. Chamber music. Good grief. It is called chamber music because it is intended for a chamber, that is, a small room. This small room is unable to seat a large audience, and for very good reason. Chamber music is intended as an intimate exchange of the musical experience between friends. The notion that it should be heard in huge concert halls and competitions, simply absurd. This approach leads to the destruction of the intimate nature of the music as it is distorted for show. I mean, perhaps we should admit defeat altogether and go even further with this competition mentality by setting various chamber groups against each other, playing simultaneously, exactly the same as a footy game or a roller derby. I bet there would be no shortage of groups desperate and stupid enough to participate. Thanks to the influence of competitions, the piano recital is, in most instances, a museum piece. It is more and more bereft of recent music, as is the symphony orchestra concert and the opera. I'm certain both Franz Liszt and Peggy Glanville-Hicks would be utterly appalled. This is a direct result of the timid capitulation of music management to audience pressure for nostalgia, also known as the blind leading the blind, as it were, and the vicious churn of uninspired competition musicians becoming jurors when they're too old to compete at age 32 or whatever. So, I imagine Peggy Glanville-Hicks would have given up writing for these expiring mediums, as so many composers have already, to concentrate on the small screen, on film, on dance, or on smaller ensembles of enlightened and energised individuals like Astra and those part of the New Music Network, such as IHOS Opera. Oh, whoops, sorry, they've had their funding cut. Finally, an important question for Peggy would be why, in this century of catastrophic global warming, why is the lifestyle of all musicians not being examined and modified accordingly? Why is globetrotting still accepted and even glorified as a responsible attitude to maintaining a career? Why is such activity not completely ridiculed as the profligate, selfish and outmoded carbon footprint that it actually is? And why are not more efforts being made to use technology to alleviate this problem? Why are we still impressed with, and why do we agree to pay for, jet-setting conductors or bands of narcissistic musicians stuffing up the planet in the pursuit of their egomaniacal careers? Are classical musicians simply more bovine, immodest and thoughtless now than in Peggy's day? It certainly appears so, with the possible exception of her spectacularly self-seeking husband, Stanley Bate. So please allow me to summarise. The following 9 points are somewhat overlapping and certainly interdependent. 1. Australia can be very proud of its musicians and composers. 2. Australian art music, however, is not as healthy as it is claimed by some. 3. Classical music conformity is a major problem in Australia. 4. Competition philosophy is crippling Australian-made art music. 5. The major music organisations are not fulfilling their responsibilities towards Australian music. 6. There is blatant misdirection of funding, amounting to corruption of the funding process. 7. There is grossly inadequate musical education of the public. 8. If the young only learn to hear familiar art music, they will only seek familiar art music. And if they only ever hear imported art music, they will never truly value the art music of their own country. 9. Hypocrisy is rife, but is the glue that holds this mess together. Solutions. What rehabilitation would Peggy recommend? I can't be certain, of course, but I'm fairly sure she would endorse most of the following 11 points. 1. Only Australians to be appointed conductor laureates of Australian orchestras, with the responsibility of deciding repertoire. The current arrangement of imported conductors has resulted in an alarming decrease of Australian musical content, due mainly to the disdain of these conductors for our own music. 2. 50% Australian repertoire mandatory on radio, other media and in concerts. Since last week, I have hardened my position further. If these music organisations and broadcast media continue to oppose such a quota, then I think Australian taxpayers, via the funding bodies, that is, all of us here tonight, are quite within their rights to then argue for a total withdrawal of public subsidisation. These music organisations and broadcasters could then be free to play whatever their expensive, taxpayer-subsidised research tells them to, but now funded solely by the private sponsors and audiences who don't like Australian music, and so end their unnecessary suffering. 3. Music education to form the core of the school curriculum so that everyone has a basic grasp of music fundamentals. Also, more importantly, so that kids will grow up with greater intelligence due to the recently scientifically supported beneficial effects of acoustic music making on the white matter of their brains. 4. Music education, particularly of the disadvantaged, to be a priority for all music-aligned bodies. There's a pressing need to expand the musical palette of all audiences. 5. At the moment, the orchestras and the opera receive the lion's share of taxpayer dollars, leaving other artists in desperate straits. The proportion is 80 million for the triennially funded groups and 5 million for everyone else. The solution is that taxpayer funding to orchestras and the opera needs to be dependent on the percentage of Australian content. As that content is now only 7%, that would free up 93%. That is $74.4 million of the current triennial funding for distribution amongst the Australian composers and performers who are not connected with those august bodies and who, quite frankly, offer far better bang for the buck as far as original exportable content is concerned. 6. The Australian Music Centre is our main dedicated resource of Australian fine musical content and intellectual property. It should not have to go begging to the Australia Council for its funding, along with the very artists it represents, but should be directly funded by the federal government. 7. We should all be aware that classical music competitions produce conformity and stultify innovation. So, 8. Boycott all classical music competitions. We don't need them. They are an unnecessary evil. While we're at it, 9. Ban the use of Australian taxpayers' dollars to fund music and opera beloved of white supremacists. 10. Ban Australian tax dollars being used to fund international artist management groups and their conservative artists who peddle such inegalitarian musical philosophy. Australia no longer has a White Australia policy, in case some opera lovers haven't noticed. 11. Finally, garner from the Australian public enthusiastic support for Australian instrument makers using local reclaimed timbers, such as Stewart & Sons. There are many others. Much as the Finns did with Nokia phones, obviously they didn't use wood, but and public ridicule for the naysayers and snobs. In closing, I hope Peggy Glanville-Hicks would approve these observations. From my personal perspective, I've chosen to spend my time encouraging, especially Australian composers, to continue to create new work for the piano. I do this not because I think the piano is the cutting-edge technology it was in Liszt's day. Far from it. It is antique technology. No, I encourage new music because I cannot see the point in agreeing to management pressure to perform a more and more limited repertoire of ancient covers. I don't think classical music has stopped evolving, even if some older audiences do. More urgently, I want to limit my carbon footprint as much as possible by working with my local community of struggling artists. The days of travelling the globe to service a music career at the expense of the planet have come to an end. The creation of original, intellectual capital for export, via technological means preferably, and for our self-respect, I see as the only way forward for Australian classical music. The one-way, so-called free market philosophy pursued by our major art music organisations has been a disaster for Australian music. I cite the case of the Australian Music Centre and its current tenuous position. All that this free market profiteering has achieved is to increase the global circuit, or should I say circus, of classical music snobbery and cultural imperialism to exploit Australian arts resources, but at the same time to exclude Australian performers and composers, or, in the case of one venue, ghettoise them in a patronising series called Local Heroes. If you doubt this, take a swift survey of our Australian conductor laureates for starters. Make zero sign. We have a new generation used to getting their music free of charge. What prospects are there for our young musicians hoodwinked into learning orchestral excerpts and opera arias, to say nothing of our hapless pianists and composers? I try to live up to the impossibly high standards of commitment and vision of Peggy Glanville-Hicks and her ilk, and I know I fail miserably. But I cannot think of a greater cause to aspire to for my limited talents. I sincerely hope, for the sake of our young people, that Australian art music continues to attract our brightest minds and does not turn them off by slavishly promoting competition philosophy and, consequently, importing musicians who do not have any sense of responsibility to young Australian musicians, to say nothing of the planet, and who do not respect Australian music, yet are given the power to dictate to Australian performers and composers how to spend our own tax money. Thank you. Well, I think this is an interesting problem because a template for our university system was forced on all of the universities about 40 years ago. And since that time, universities have been asked to operate as industries. And I think there are a few problems with that, not the least of which is the intensive way that music needs to be taught to people. And the only way that conservatoriums seem to be able to operate is in this hierarchical, competitive fashion. The students now are not known as students, they're known as customers, aren't they? And they perform, I beg yours? Clients. Well, I think that's a simile. A university is a think tank of society, or at least that's the way they were set up, and I see them as leading the community, not responding to the community's desires. Business does that. Business provides a product. But the universities really, in my opinion, operate as the think tank. They have now become in service to the society, and I think that's the problem with the conservatorium, that they have customers who give customer feedback, and it's wrong in my opinion. But I also see the incredible decline. I mean, I was asked to do this speech having left the mainland since 2003, and it's quite stark, the descent of the situation. It's got much, much worse since I was last living in Melbourne, and it's got much worse in relation to the funding that we as taxpayers give to these large organisations. And what do we get back from that? Increasingly, well, less and less we get back in the form of original content. And I think as taxpayers we need to look at that and demand more, as you would in any other area. And particularly when there are no Australian conductor laureates able to push for new Australian work, which is really the funding comes through organisations which have as their platform the creation of Australian content. That's central to a lot of these, the funding bodies and, broadcasters. It's central that is what they're there for, and we're getting less and less over the years. Well, music education, in my opinion, should be about opening up children's brains, not closing them down and narrowing and streaming them into things. Of course, they need some sort of sense of progress through an art form, but kids are all different. If you work in that area, you know that's the case, and it doesn't matter how long it takes them to read or speak. The important thing is that they can make themselves understood and they can read, that they can understand things. And therefore, you have a child then who can, in their own time, explore the world. And it's the same with music. What we do is put grades, levels on people, and people are all completely different. And I think an enlightened teacher knows that and adjusts their teaching accordingly. But we need to have self-respect in ourselves as a nation, and we need to be confident in the people who are coming through, and we need to offer them hope, and we need to offer them some point to the tremendously rigorous training that they receive. You know this as well as I do, Tony. And at the moment, there is no point. Just learn your orchestral excerpts and go off and play in an orchestra in Germany somewhere, which are all folding up. That's the attitude. I think that attitude is a mistake. The important thing for me has always been that to know that the composers who we consider great masters were great iconoclasts in their day and great nonconformists. I think that's really an important thing to remember as a teacher, that all the angst that the kids are going through can be very much related to great musicians, as well as the music that's happening all around them at the moment. But the most important thing is to try to uncover the sense of intelligence, the sense of study, the sense of pleasure and intricacy that classical music does have, and why it is difficult, the reasons why it came into being, why is it important. These questions are never addressed. If kids knew more about that, why, how Beethoven coped with various disabilities during his life, and still music was the main thing for him. That's sort of an example, and you see it with all of the musicians that we consider great, Liszt, Messiaen, whoever. They all had these periods in their lives where they felt they were completely alone, and only music really, maybe not the case with Liszt and Messiaen, but certainly with Beethoven, music was the thing that got them through these things. That's a sort of message which is inspiring for kids, I think. And rather than, resorting to self-harm by listening to a group like Crystal Castles, and, doing themselves in because it's fashionable, it might be better for them to think about how composers using new languages, using new forms, really exploring music, how they coped with, terribly depressing times during their lives. And all of them had it. They're not all overnight successes. And that's important for kids. I think that has to do a lot with the politics of the way these organisations operate, and they're becoming more and more a practice pad for publishers such as Boosey and Hawkes, powerful global publishers. And you notice, what was that guy's name? Cancelli. He was a huge hit for a season or something, and he's just disappeared. I don't see his music being played anymore, but I distinctly remember a huge fuss being made about his music. That was driven mainly by international publishers. So our orchestras are really being used as a practice pad, if you like. And the comments I get from people, say from London or from any of the other centres, is that the types of music and the diversity of music is so much more there. And Australian orchestras are very, very conservatively programmed according to what you can hear overseas. I got some work with Australian orchestras was because I had international management. And they deliberately went in to beat them over the head, and they can do that because they can apply pressure for, other artists who might be the conductors of those orchestras, for instance. And unfortunately, that is the way it works. But when we are paying for it, and such a lot of you're paying every orchestra, we're paying $5 million a year for, and that's our taxpayers' money. I don't know about you, but I'm having trouble making ends meet a lot of the time. And I'm not seeing younger composers coming through being nurtured by these organisations. I'm not seeing anything being driven by the conductor laureates. All I'm seeing is, boxed set of Mahler symphonies, Wagner cycles, the same old stuff that's been recorded hundreds of times. Well, in fact, there's a lot of positive chauvinism in those countries. And if you go to the Moscow Conservatoire website, for instance, you'll find musicians listed under Russian, and then the other column will be foreign. And I don't see us doing that in Australia. They've got very positive chauvinism towards their own music, and the Germans do as well. I've been hissed and booed in Bavaria for playing Messiaen. I'm arguing for diversity, but that's what you're saying. You want it to be freely, music should be free. The problem is that our Australian musicians and composers are not being encouraged to present music and to develop their musical skills. And the situation is getting worse and worse. And that's what I'm saying. We need to arrest that. We need to look at this model. And if that doesn't change, I think it does need to be led by powerful people, and the powerful people are the conductor laureates. We had a flowering under Stuart Challender of Australian composition, and we had a flowering under Patrick Thomas as well. It's the conductors who beat the orchestras around the head and just say, you've got to bloody well play this. And that's who has to do it. If we constantly have name conductors, some of whom aren't very good conductors, coming in and conducting our orchestras merely as practice pads, stepping stones to some other gig, then we're not going to get any sort of forward development of Australian music, and we need that as a country for our self-respect. Well, the standard is completely subjective anyway, and it should be in art. Critical mass of people and enlightened teachers, we've always been able to do without competitions in art, and still art flourishes. What I'm saying, the emphasis is now so much on competition philosophy, it infects every aspect of our life. As artists, we don't need that. We're beyond that. It just does not influence the way we do music. We do music for other reasons than competition. And kids should be shown that that is the reason you do any form of art. Art is to enrich your life, and if they're going to live for such a long period of time, it's even more important. All of the humanities, which are put under this cookie-cutter template, as I was referring before with Peter Neville, it's not right.